Good morning, folks. Your fearless leader here with a fearless cup of coffee, here to walk you through your lecture for today. So your lecture for today is a little bit different than we would have otherwise been doing. What we would have been doing in class is primarily analyzing this very long book that I made you read called The Autobiography of Malcolm X, which is also one of the coolest books ever written. So I want you to be thinking about that throughout our lecture conversation today, and primarily when you write your discussion board posts, I want them to be on Malcolm X's work. And I've sort of geared the questions to make them applicable in that way. But I love talking about this. What I've done instead is really have just written a lecture on the context of the Black Power movement, and I want you to be thinking about how Malcolm X fits into that and what it tells us about history. I mean, I love giving this lecture and talking about this because it's just not what we typically talk about when we talk about civil rights. We typically talk about Martin Luther King Jr. Well, I'll get to that part of the lecture eventually, but I like talking about this because it's something that is often glanced over in introductory level history classes or looked at as unimportant, but really it was not just important for what it did for Black people, which it was important for, but it was also important for the ways that it criticized rights-based movements. And that's really what I want to focus on today. If we have looked at feminism as a rights-based movement, if we've looked at African American rights as a rights-based movement, this is really different in that it says, you know what, rights aren't enough. That's not actually what we should be focusing on. Maybe we should be focusing on physical safety and moral uplift and a couple of other things, and pride. So really, today's lecture is cool because it is a criticism of some of the earlier things that we have been talking about from the left, not from the right, but from the left, which is really exciting. Okay, things that you need to think about. My computer takes a really long time the first time I want to switch slides, and I don't know why. There we go. Okay, what are you supposed to actually know after this class is over? Why did the Black Power movement appeal to African Americans? And I have asked you, again, in your discussion board posts to specifically refer to Malcolm X. Why did it appeal to Malcolm X? What sorts of things did Black Power encourage? What did they encourage individual people to do? What did they encourage society to do? How did they see social change? Those broad questions about what did they want? What did people in the Black Power movement actually want to see? A little bit of a historical question that I don't have on your discussion board because I'm going to give you the answer in the context of this lecture is, why do you think that we venerate the civil rights movement but we tend to ignore the Black Power movement? We will discuss the traditional history of civil rights. That will happen. But most of you are at least somewhat familiar with that in the United States. That's a story we tell ourselves often. But why do you think that we ignore Black Power? Why does this make people uncomfortable? Start thinking about that. And ultimately, I want to know what legacy Malcolm X left. He died in the course of his work, right? He was assassinated. So what legacy did his work leave us? What legacy is this man known for? How did he change the way that we think about politics? How might someone reading him now use this work to better understand America? Those are the things that I want you to talk about and be thinking about as we go through today's lecture on Black Power and where it came from and what the heck it was. First things first, what is not Black Power? Okay, well, that's actually a terrible way to put it. Ignore that I just said that. What is the traditional story? That's a better way to put it. So when we talk about civil rights, what are we typically navigating? How are we typically defining that? Well, there's a pretty traditional story that we tell ourselves as historians and as people in American culture about how Black people got their rights. And that story is really, it's simple, but it is brave and it is beautiful and it is glorious. It's a glorious epic in a way of thinking about a story, right? And so that traditional story goes something like this. There was slavery. Slavery was very bad. And then there was emancipation, and emancipation was very good. Everybody likes Abraham Lincoln. Everybody thinks that this is a cool thing. There were, of course, Southerners in the South, though, that didn't think this was a good thing and that were terrible to Black people. And because of that, there needed to be activism to address the question of Black people's rights. This is where we get the NAACP. This is where we get cool people like Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois, and that first criticism in the beginning of the 20th century. Then, not included in here, is the story that black people participated in World War I and World War II, and the nation came to see them as worthy political participants. Not everywhere, though, and so civil rights demonstrations on buses and in diners really led people to recognize that black people should have rights and not work it all out, because in 1964 and 1965, legislation was passed in the name of the Civil Rights Bill and the Voting Rights Act that gave black people their rights. Huzzah, we're good and we're done. This narrative is the rights-based traditional story. We will talk about it because we're going to talk about that rights-based narrative in the class that we're going on Monday, because that's the class that I spent on Martin Luther King Jr. That is the watchword for all of this, is MLKJ, right? Like that, he's the one that orchestrated this movement. This is how it goes. And so it's got a pretty specific cast of characters. It's got a pretty specific cast of tools, but there are some problems with that original story. Nothing in it is actually false. Nothing in that story is actually wrong. But there's a significant amount of work and a significant amount that it leaves out. So if you go back to that, you can see that there are some pretty strong holes, like what happens in the 1930s and the 1940s. What are women doing? How does the story of feminism change the story of African American rights? In other words, things get a little bit more complicated when you take into account the fact that black people did not just exist like on their own in isolation from other people. The story also doesn't really explain what black people were fighting against. One of the problems of that story is that, will you stop growling, Maya? Maya doesn't like the traditional story of civil rights. That's okay. It basically leaves out what white people were doing. So it's hard to see why black people needed to fight against what. Like that traditional civil rights story doesn't really explain the actual work that white people were doing to make black society struggle, right? That's an important part of the story that's left out of there. And most importantly for the context of this lecture, it doesn't leave out alternate visions. That is a story premised on rights, premised on this idea that black people were basically nothing until the Emancipation Proclamation and the 14th Amendment said that they were citizens, and then after that, everything was an effort to just become citizens via the state. But in reality, the question that increasingly arose among black communities in the 1960s and 70s was, is being a citizen going to be enough? I mean, what happens when you have the right to vote, but you live in this world that is not able to accommodate black people in any way? That was the question that black power proponents were increasingly asking, and one of the main things that this story leaves out for us. You might think that that's like a little bit dramatic. Do rights even matter? Does voting even matter? Should we focus on citizenship? Maybe a little dramatic, but think about the world that black people are encountering. In the early 20th century, which we are going to, has legacies and stays alive, right? But in the early 20th century, you think about it like this. The KKK was crazy powerful. They were not just outspoken advocates like outside of the law, but they were also deeply embedded in the law. There were people that were public servants, that were judges, that were very affiliated with the KKK. Lynch law dominated Southern life. Lynch law is not just hanging. It's this idea that Southerners, white Southerners, could adopt sort of mob mentality and this idea of vigilante justice to target black communities. That's very much what Ida B. Wells wrote about, and we looked about earlier in this class. So the KKK is powerful. The Lynch law is powerful. Political participation makes black people subject to both of those things. Not only that, but there are also other problems informing the black community that aren't able to be resolved through the vote itself. So economic inequality is so rampant that most black people lack access to education. It's so rampant that most black businesses cannot survive. Black people are not making nearly as much money as white people and therefore don't have the same kind of power in a capitalist society. And there is this thing called gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is when you draw the voting districts of a certain area in order to, so if you say like, here's the black community, but if we draw a line through the black community and put only part of it in the white communities, they're not going to have as much say in their collective vote. It's a way to manipulate a democratic system to disenfranchise people, basically. Even though they may vote, their vote proportionately doesn't count as much. Gerrymandering was rampant in the South in particular, and it very much so meant that the black vote didn't count. So again, people began to question if this is the world that we are facing, like if it's this hard to participate in the world around us, should the vote be what we focus on? And out of this context emerged a man named Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey was interesting. He was born in Jamaica. He spent most of his life, he spent a good deal of his life in Jamaica, but then he traveled around Southern America, and he also went to Europe. And he started talking about something called, he didn't call it this. This is what scholars have called it in the past. He called it African people, but other people have now called this the African diaspora. And that basically refers to black people spread throughout the globe. And black people had been spread throughout the globe, not on their own free will, forced by people who captured them and took them into slavery. Garvey's international travels made him think concretely about this thing called the African diaspora. And he said, what we need to do is we all need to go back to Africa and we need to become a strong nation that is the nation of Africa. This is the idea of black nationalism. So white people should not participate, and black people should not participate in white society. They need to return to themselves. They need to depend on one another. They need to have a strong sense of patriotism and racial pride. And this was a really interesting argument because it essentially was the newer way of thinking about colonization societies, which we talked about in our last class, right? Did we? No, we didn't. You wouldn't have heard about that. I'm sorry. That I talked about way, way earlier in the first half of U.S. history. But Garveyism is interesting because there are some KKK members that support it. Like Garvey made alliances with KKK members because they were like, yeah, get out of here and go back to Africa. So it was a really interesting moment. But he said that was what we actually need. While this wasn't necessarily going to happen, Garvey was by this time in the U.S., by the way. This was not necessarily going to happen, so Garvey said, well, if that's not going to be the primary way that we do this, we need to rely on black institutions, black businesses, black support, and we need to think about our race differently. So he formed the United Negro Improvement Association, the UNIA, and we looked at this document a little bit earlier in our class. And the UNIA focused on supporting black businesses, focused on creating a black sense of morality, focused on having a black sense of pride in the United States. And he even supported a couple of this is what ended up taking him down. He supported a couple of industries that were black-owned industries and sold stocks in them. That was a movement that was ultimately, did I not? Oh, I didn't. Okay. That ended up being his downfall because Garvey created this business called the Black Star Line, which is a shipping line that he believed would be the shipping line to transport African Americans back to Africa. But he oversold stocks in it, and he got in trouble for that, so he was arrested and eventually deported back to Africa, which really got rid of the movement in the 19-teens and 1920s. But as much as it got rid of that black nationalist movement in that era, it didn't get rid of the problems that had caused black nationalism in the first place. In fact, the problems that had caused black nationalism continued to grow. In the traditional civil rights story, we talk about the impact of world wars on African Americans gaining citizenship rights. But in reality, those wars caused terrible deaths and destruction for the black community. After World War I, in the summer of 1919, black Americans faced the Red Summer, which was called the Red Summer because there were so many racial riots throughout the North and the South, right? But it's called the Red Summer because many African Americans died in civil unrest related to race, particularly because white people did not want them to come back from the war and take white jobs. Likewise, after World War II, returning veterans also faced problems. They realized that when they were coming back after the war, they wanted all of these benefits of the GI Bill to apply to them, but they typically didn't. And we talked about this in our class on the 1950s in black and white, that most of those things that were benefits of the GI Bill were actually shut out to African Americans. And so the GI Bill, while it helped many white veterans, it actually strengthened the divisions in society. And then we have to remember that black people were disproportionately recruited for the Vietnam War because the exceptions that applied to the war, the things that gave people exemptions, white people exemptions often were not things that black people could aspire to or achieve. So although Booker T. Washington said, we need to acclimate to society by being productive members of society, what black people are seeing is that's actually just not happening. It doesn't matter how much we fight in their wars. It doesn't matter how much we start businesses. It doesn't matter how much we vote. It doesn't matter how much we obtain economic success. This is not a world that we can participate in. So a couple of the things that I wanted to show you that are really cool resources. I figure if we're going to be doing a digital class, we should look at some digital. This computer is so unbelievably slow. Oh, for the love of God. Okay, we're going to do this the hard way. Copy. I figure if this is going to be a digital class, we should actually look at some digital resources. Okay, this is the summer of 1919 that I told you about, the Red Summer. This is a resource called ArcGIS, and ArcGIS is really cool because they can record moments and then attach a story to it. So some historians have used this as a presentation model to talk about where those riots were. All of these pins represent a riot that happened, a race riot that happened in that summer alone. And then you can go down one by one and look at these in chronological order. So this one you can see images of, it's about a church. This one in Charleston, spurred by booze, soldiers, and the threat of black men to white women. Now again, remember when we talked about this with Ida B. Wells? That's always a thing that white people are worried about. And then they've got other primary sources here, like you can, well, they don't have the whole thing, but you can see the source that this is coming from, right? So in the 19-teens, most of this was still about the threat of black men to white women. That was a made-up threat that white people were petrified of. But you can see how a story map like this works, which is really cool. And I want you to take some time to go through that and understand how you can use that historically speaking. Okay? In an upper level class, sometimes I have students make these as a project. There was another one, and I want to say before we continue, like, how do those race riots happen? A lot of those race riots are not started by black people. There's this idea that white people are anticipating black violence and react accordingly before it even happens. And then things get complicated. There's also this really interesting resource. Oh, I linked you to the New York Times, but you have to actually go to the map to find it, sorry. Okay, and I looked at too many New York Times subscriptions today. If you haven't gone to the New York Times yet today, you can do this. But this is a really cool resource because this shows you lynchings by county in the South, and you can actually pull them up and see where they are. See if this is the right link. Nope, okay. One more, sorry guys. Patience with your old fogey professor. Ah, this is actually the right one though. It is. So I have given you the right link. Aha, here we go. This is another digital resource. You can see lynchings between 1877 and 1950, and you can limit it by year if you want. So there are various ways to sort of change this data on the map. And you can also focus in on a state and on a county. Let's go to Montgomery County in Georgia, and you can see things about that county. Okay. So I encourage you to check that out. Just want to give you an idea of some of the things that digital history can do. Okay.
In 1933, in Birmingham, Alabama, schoolteacher Elizabeth Lawrence was lynched by a white mob. She was not accused of any crime, but had merely scolded white children who were throwing rocks at her. When her son sought justice for his mother's lynching, the same mob pursued him, forcing him to flee to Boston.
Okay. Cool. So you can engage with this and see the kinds of things that black people were lynched over throughout the 20th century. But what I want to emphasize for the class is that those issues, they don't stop. And people thought, well, this is just a consequence of emancipation. Okay, but like, we're talking about continuing through the world wars, continuing through, this is not just an issue of emancipation. The people that are having these problems are not people that ever lived in slavery anymore. And so those issues, that racism continues to be very, very violent. Remember when we did this? Yes. Okay. And it wasn't just individual issues too. It was also broad scale riots. So it's lynching, but it is also that these are broader city problems. And you can see that in each of these instances, it's usually that they're instigated by the police and then filed up by a community, and they get complicated very fast, and tracing the origin of them gets really hard. But basically, you've got a world that like nothing can happen without breaking out into racial violence. There's one in Chicago, there's one in Harlem, there's one in LA, and all of these are generally about mild incidences. Something like a racial slur was thrown and then things escalated is the kind of thing that you'll hear. Or things escalated from an insult in a bar, or things escalated after police pulled over someone and they were accused of racial profiling. So things like this are common, continue to happen throughout the 50s and throughout the 60s. And increasingly, black people blame the police as agents of the states that really, they don't help these riots. They harm the black community by really starting these riots in a lot of incidents, by overreacting to black citizens and by overreacting to things that black people had done. And so the question of police violence now is very large, and I just want you to think about the ways that that's not a new conversation. It's a much older conversation. And in the 1960s and the 1970s, they were very right. There were rampant civic abuses of black people, and there were no real laws against them. And so the police start to be seen as the bad guy in these engagements, which led people to question, is nonviolence the best form of protest? Like, nonviolence is not actually nonviolent. In the Children's Crusade, which we'll talk about on Monday, Martin Luther King Jr. led waves of school children against attack dogs. Like, what you learned when you learned to do nonviolence is, here's how to cover your head, and here's how to protect yourself against tear gas. And black people began saying, like, do we really need to throw ourselves at attack dogs in order to get rights? Should that be our focus? Should we have to go through that in order to be participants in society? Like, nonviolence for us does not mean nonviolence. How much is it acceptable to just acknowledge that you will be physically vulnerable to the state before you can get your rights? Because think about where they were looking at. Protest was all around them. The white backlash to civil rights demonstrations always happened in direct proportion to those demonstrations, right? White people aren't just going out and attacking black people indiscriminately. They're attacking black people that are arguing for their rights. And it became, there were bombings, there were race riots, there were assassinations, there were political coups. Like, the idea was, how much should we have to submit ourselves to this in order to achieve rights? Is this really the conversation that we should be having? Is it even possible to achieve rights in this atmosphere? And it wasn't just that. It wasn't just that they had to be physically vulnerable. The policies themselves that white people had enacted over years caused a world in which black people could not get ahead. And even Martin Luther King Jr. acknowledged this. The economic deprivation, the social isolation, the inadequate housing, and the general despair of thousands of Negroes teeming in northern and western ghettos are the ready seeds which give birth to the tragic expressions of violence. In other words, this physical world around us is not one in which peace can exist. Over the course of his life, Martin Luther King Jr. actually became increasingly more amenable to the Black Power movement. We will talk about that when we talk about him. But the reality is that cities and the way that cities were structured were damaging to black communities. And they were damaging to black communities in a few ways. Primarily, it's economic, right? The fact that black people felt trapped in cities, that they felt trapped in this cycle of urbanity really causes increased turn to the drug trade as a way to make money, then increased dependence on the drug trade. It then means increased incarceration, which only furthers those problems. And so there's kind of a spiraling pattern that black people are saying, rights isn't going to help this. We have poverty in the cities. We have physical distance from any of the facilities that we would need to get out of these. We have a lot of issues that are simply not being fixed by rights. And in the middle of this, in 1964, the Moynihan Report came out. So Moynihan is an interesting dude who thought in his best estimation that he was trying to help black people. He thought that he was going to provide documentation on what the economic poverty had done to black families. But he basically said, economic poverty in black communities has led black people to be immoral. It's led husbands to leave wives and wives to have multiple children, and he really said the disintegration of the black family is due to economic distress. But people read the Moynihan Report as a justification for those policies because they read him as saying black people don't have any family values, they don't have any morality. So the Moynihan Report ended up being fairly disastrous for the black cause. So you've got white people that are saying black people can never have these things, you've got violence, you've got really a world in which rights don't seem to make sense. When King referred to urban despair, he referred to the fact that racism was not just racism. Racism was physical vulnerability to violence. It was poverty. It was a cycle of incarceration. It was segregation from the facilities that you would need to get out of that, like educational institutions, right? Racism was complicated, and just having the vote, especially in a world that gerrymandered the vote out of existence, wasn't going to fix those problems. And so there were alternate ideologies that developed to cope with that. One of those ideologies was the Nation of Islam. So the Nation of Islam is not the same thing as Islam as a religion. They share certain roots, but it is definitely a different project and definitely different theological beliefs. But the Nation of Islam is brought to the United States by this guy named Elijah Muhammad, and he thinks that you can really make Muslim theology about race. And that espoused a couple of things. The theology of Islam then in this, and again, I separate those, these are not the same thing, said that we can understand history as a process of good versus evil, and white people are the evil. White people are the devil. They are the ones that are the product of Cain. They are the ones that have shut black people down throughout history. And as a consequence of these theological beliefs, the organization argued for a couple of things. Pride in the black race. Pride in being part of that race. That came directly from Garveyism. A push towards both physical and moral fitness. So very, very strong regulations against alcohol, drugs, and against certain kinds of meats, many of which came right from Muslim ideology. And a desire to see economic sustainability in the black community. So an encouragement of black people to patronize black businesses as much as possible and to form enclaves where it was possible to survive just by patronizing black business. That was church-based, though, and not all people wanted to see an organization that was only church-based be the response to these problems. So there was also another interesting person named Stokely Carmichael, and this is an image of Stokely. Sir Lee Carmichael led what has come to be called the Black Panthers, what he called the Black Panthers. And this was basically an organization that said, this is not enough. We do not need to be nonviolent. We need to focus on defense. And the Black Panthers have been called a terrorist organization. I mean, they've been called a lot of things, but essentially they didn't advocate attacking white people. They just advocated having guns to protect themselves against white violence. And they had arsenals of those guns for members, and they had marches and were militaristic. And the whole goal was not to attack white society, but it was to believe that you could defend yourself against white violence. The Black Panthers get a bad rap, though, because they were supposedly a society that was a totally violent one, but they weren't. They actually did a lot of other things. They were the first organization to really support school programs in conjunction with the welfare rights movement. They supported things like Heads First, and they created breakfast programs in schools and tried other ways to address the poverty of the Black community. They focused on education and community organizing, particularly adult education, recognizing that education for African American people did not exist in any real form when adults needed it as children, right? So they pulled back to some of those earlier traditions of Black activism in organizing that. And they also raised money to pay for the legal defense of people who had used armed defense to defend themselves against white people in previous encounters. Much of that tough work was actually done by Black women. So the organization of Black Power was pretty famous for excluding Black women from their leadership. In fact, the Nation of Islam itself had really strict rules about gender and how men and women are supposed to behave, rules that I find very, very problematic, and is one of the reasons that I had you read this book, because Malcolm X was big on those rules. And so it's worth thinking about the ways that in seeking racial pride and something different, they often excluded Black women. But Black women were the ones that kept the organizations going. They were the ones that launched the protests. They were the ones that fed the children. They were the idea, though they were members of the party that actually did some of the most significant work. And they started to frame an alternate ideology. One of the things I would have loved to have you read, if it hadn't required reading 2 books for a single class, is this, the autobiography of Angela Davis. Angela Davis provides an interesting counterpart to Malcolm X, because Davis writes about how the movement itself was sexist, and we needed to change our understanding of activism in order to better account for women. I'm going to read to you out of this book. I had become acquainted very early with the widespread presence of an unfortunate syndrome among some Black male activists, namely, to confuse their political activity with an assertion of their maleness. They confused their political activity with an assertion of their maleness. I love that. They saw, and some continue to see, Black manhood as something separate from Black womanhood. These men view Black women as a threat to their attainment of manhood, especially those Black women who take initiative and work to become leaders in their own right. The constant harangue by the U.S. men was that I needed to redirect my energies and use them to give my man strength and inspiration so that he might more effectively contribute his talents to the struggle for Black liberation. For me, though, revolution was never an interim thing to do before settling down. It was no fashionable club with newly minted jargon or a new kind of social life made glamorous by costume. Revolution is a serious thing, the most serious thing about a revolutionary's life. When one commits itself to the struggle, it must be for a lifetime. In other words, she really argues women are part of this struggle. They are not simply the wives of men in this struggle. They are not the mothers of the children in this struggle. They have to create their own kind of philosophy in order to be part of this. And Angela Davis was extraordinary because she was able to tie the Black Power movement to communism, to feminist liberation, and to broader movements. And she's not the only one. I want to refer here back to the Combahee River Collective, which is something that you read for our class on feminism. And it showcases the way that feminism often disregarded the lives of Black women. So this is a radical organization that expanded the logic of Black power to address issues of feminism and homophobia. And that's why this is so crazy, because they managed to take this pride and apply it in multiple areas. Did they want rights? Of course they wanted rights. But there's also the sense that rights are just not enough. The Black Power movement, well, it's not really fair to say that the Black Power movement ended. The Black Panthers certainly ended. And they ended in a fairly violent way as they were targeted by the FBI because, frankly, white people were terribly, terribly, terribly afraid of a bunch of black people with guns. And so there's a lot of pushback from the FBI. There's a lot of monitoring of the organization. Angela Davis is thrown in jail, although she's eventually acquitted. And so that movement itself is really shut down by police repression of their activities. However, the idea that Black Power should exist mutated. That didn't actually go away in any real sense because it just went into other activities. Black women continued to argue for Black Power within the welfare rights movement and the feminist movement. So particularly from women, this idea that Black Power rather than rights should be the focus did continue. And then there's this dude. So what I had you read for your homework, again, was Malcolm X. Malcolm X's book is fascinating to me because it's so long, because it covers so much chronologically. It covers from his childhood all the way up to his assassination. And it talks about, I mean, he was everywhere at once, right? Like, he was in these communities that were dealing with racial riots. He was in Harlem at the advent of jazz. He was... it talks about dodging the draft in World War II. He talks about going to Africa and actually realizing that real Islam is not what he was talking about, right? And he has a break with the Nation of Islam. So he's a fascinating character, and he just is everywhere at the right moment in this story, which is why I had you read this autobiography, which you may be confused about the authorship. Malcolm X was working on this autobiography with a guy named Alex Haley, but he was killed before he could finish it. So it's published posthumously, published after his death by Alex Haley. So I want you to be thinking about that and how he fits into this broader story. In order to do that, I've given you a set of directed questions, and I can't wait to see what you do for your participation. Okay, I'll be looking to hear from you guys. Have a good one.